Right, thanks very much. Just to say a bit more about myself, I'm the Education Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which some of you will know is Britain's oldest free market think tank, founded in 1954, and in fact the second oldest think tank of that kind anywhere on the planet. The only one that's older is the Foundation for Economic Education in the US, which was founded in 1948. I basically run all the kind of outreach and educational programs there. I'm very glad to be up here. It's always good to come back to Scotland. I actually was born here and spent a large part of my formative years here. I graduated from St Andrews University, got my PhD from there. And it's particularly appropriate that I should be speaking about this subject in Scotland and also in a Quaker meeting house, because this is a subject which the society is very interested in historically. A lot of major thinkers about education have come from the society historically. And Scotland had for a long time a very distinct and particular take upon education, the idea of the democratic intellect, to quote the title of a very famous book on the subject, which I might say something about in the course of this presentation. What I'm going to try and argue essentially is that, first of all, modern formal education, really in design, is something that we ought to be opposed to. Opposed to that is what you believe in education. You believe that the purpose of education, as the word itself suggests, is to draw out and develop the talents, abilities and innate qualities of people. That, I think, is a very important, worthwhile goal, but it's not what the modern formal education system, the schooling system, is about. And secondly, that in fact we're at the moment living through a revolution that is transforming education worldwide. And I will predict quite confidently that within 10 years, most of what we now think of as formal education will have been swept away. And within 20 years, people will think it absolutely incredible, not to say miraculous, that there was a time when we basically sent most of our young people to what essentially is a prison for about 12 years. Now, I should explain that this position I'm going to put forward to you is not one that I've always held. I used to be a fairly conventional kind of free marketeer where education was concerned. I like the idea of education vouchers. I used to trot out all the kind of usual arguments about how rubbish state education was and how good private education was and how we needed educational choice. And my opinions began to change partly through my own experience in the world of education, obviously at the higher education end, but also as a parent seeing what was going on lower down the education tree. But the turning point really for me was when I attended a talk given by a friend of mine, a chap called Sheldon Richman. And Sheldon said, well, he says, we libertarians, we tend to think that the state education system is a terrible disaster and completely useless. And you can see in a way why we think this. However, he said, we're wrong. In fact, if you know what the state education system is actually all about, what you realise is that in fact, until relatively recently, it's been a fantastic success. And it actually does what's intended to do, as opposed to what it purports to be doing, fantastically well. This has begun to break down, fortunately, but that has not been the case for most of its history. So what did Sheldon mean by this? And what this led me to do, because I was very much persuaded by the rest of his talk, was go and look at some of the, what you might call, educational theorists that I looked at briefly in my younger years, but overlooked. People like Ivan Illich, Paul Goodman, John Holt, the man of How Children Learn, How Children Fail fame, who later on went to write a whole number of other books, including one with the rather arresting title, Instead of Education, which is actually a very misleading title, I should add. He really means instead of school, but that's the point of the talk, really. And I also did quite a bit of historical research, and the story that comes out is like this. The modern school is not the kind of institution that has always existed. The kind of schools that we have today, even when the institution has a history that goes back several hundred years, it's not the same kind of institution that it was, say, 300 or 400 years ago. Modern schools were invented at a very, very particular place and time, and for very specific reasons. The modern school was invented in 1806 in Prussia, in the aftermath of the Prussian state's catastrophic defeat at the hands of Napoleon at the Battle of Jena. What happened after that was that a bunch of guys, led by a fellow called Stein, who was effectively the Prime Minister of Prussia at the time, put through a whole series of reforms which transformed Prussia, already one of the most, if you like, modern states in Europe, into a kind of template or model modern state for initially Germany, and increasingly as the 19th century went on, the rest of Europe, if not the world. And a crucial part of this was the creation of the modern state, the modern school. Now, interestingly and ironically, the guy responsible for this was a fellow called Wilhelm von Humboldt. who also created the modern university with his reforms to the University of Berlin. He invented things like the graduate seminar, the modern degree structure, the postgraduate program, all the other things we're familiar with. And because of the huge influence that had on the United States, it's become the template that higher education around the world has followed. Now, I say this is ironic because Humboldt was a great libertarian. And he wrote one of the great works of libertarian theory and also libertarian psychology, The Sphere and Duties of Government. And in this, Humboldt argues that the goal of government, or indeed of collective action of any kind, is to lead to the fullest and most varied development of the potential and quality of the individual. And he has all kinds of interesting biological metaphors, which I won't go into here. It's a wonderful book, I recommend it very strongly. There's an English translation of it. It had a huge influence on John Stuart Mill. And most of On Liberty is basically a kind of English gloss on Humboldt. Having said that, as I say, deeply ironically, Humboldt was concerned to create an institution which had precisely the opposite kind of aim, and this was the modern school. So what was new about the kind of schools that were created in Prussia in the aftermath of Jena compared to what had gone before, or indeed what was going on at the time? Well, first of all, this was the first time you had schools where people were taught in age groups. Previously, schools generally did not teach people in segregated age groups. They taught them, as is indeed often is the case even today in remote parts of the world, like, say, many parts of the Scottish Highlands or the outback of Australia or places like that. They were all taught together previously. Or people would be taught in ability-graded groups. So there would be people of quite different ages taught together because they were all roughly the same level of attainment in a subject. That's how Thomas Wolsey, for example, Henry VIII's Prime Minister, was able to get a degree from Oxford at the age of 14 because he was precocious and he therefore gone to Oxford along with other people of quite different ages because he was at the stage where it was appropriate for him to do this. That was not unusual, by the way. Well, it was not common, but on the other hand, it wasn't totally strange or bizarre. He was one of quite a number of people of that sort. So that's one of the first things that Humboldt and the others introduce, teaching by year groups. Another thing they introduce is the formal modes of pedagogy that you have, one which we have here actually, where people sit in rows and somebody talks at you. That was introduced essentially by the Prussians. There were various kinds of pedagogy used before, including obviously the ultimate original Greek or Roman version where you walked around with somebody who would hold a conversation with you. That's what the word actually comes from, of course. But there were many other variants as well, such as the kind of more cooperative method that Jan Amos Comenius, famous Czech educational theorist, espoused in the 17th century. The modern system which we think of as being what education is about, formal instruction by an authority figure to people who are sat in highly structured format, is again an invention of the Prussians. Another thing that's invented by the Prussians is the idea of the school day, which is divided up into clearly defined chunks of time. And in which those passage from one block of time to another is indicated by ringing of a bell or blowing of a whistle or something of that sort. They also introduced the idea of a syllabus which is taught across several years, so that instead of spending a whole week doing just one subject, you do an hour of one subject, then an hour of another subject, then an hour of another subject again. All this was introduced by them. They also introduced, most importantly, the idea of compulsory universal education. Prior to this, education had been essentially a voluntary matter. It was up to the parents, essentially, as to whether or not their children became educated. And of course, in many cases, they didn't. And what the Prussians did was to institute the idea that everyone should and had to go to school as a matter of legal obligation. And not only that, but they had to go to school for certain specified times and up to a specified age. It was 14 in the original Prussian model, but it was very soon raised, and by the 1870s the German sort of school leaving age, if you will, or the age at which you left formal education, was already up to 17. Now, why did they do this? Well, the reasons were very, very clear and very explicit. They didn't hide it, nor did any of the other 19th century educational reformers, people like Horace Mann, the person who more than anyone else was responsible for the creation of the United States school system in his capacity as president of the school board in Massachusetts. Their goal was to mould and shape the people who went through the process. This was, contrary to Humboldt's actual own personal beliefs, a system not about helping people to develop, but about guiding them, shaping them, moulding them into a particular format that was laid down in advance. In other words, this was a system intended and designed to produce people with certain qualities, What kind of people did they want to produce? Well, they wanted to produce loyal, productive citizens. They wanted to produce people, first of all, who were loyal to the Prussian state, or by extension, the state in which they lived. People who, in other words, had a sense of identity which made them obedient and loyal subjects. You can obviously see why they wanted to do this in 1806, given that the French Revolution had only just happened. Napoleon was upsetting thrones all over Europe, so the idea was very, very important to them. But they also wanted to have people who were productive. They wanted to produce, if you like, worker bees. People who would be designed, trained to work productively, and above all, do what they were told. The whole process, the entire thing was aimed at that end. Now, when you realise that that's what the purpose of the modern school is, all kinds of things that otherwise might seem strange if you stop to think about them, and we don't because we take them for granted, suddenly make sense. For example, why teach people in year groups? When you think about it, this is bonkers. What on earth is the point of teaching people who just happen to have been born in the same year together? When you think about it in an educational sense, this does not make sense. It makes much more sense to teach people according to the talent or the level they've reached in a particular subject. Well, the reason is to do with what these children in those Prussian schools were going to do after they left the gymnasium, the high school. They were going to go into the military, because one of the other things the Prussians created in those reforms is the modern mass conscript army. In fact, it had been created by the French revolutionaries with the levée en masse, but the Prussians decided that this is a pretty cool idea, and if they're going to compete with Napoleon, they've got to do the same kind of thing. They've got to have a national mass army. So they introduced the practice of universal conscription. What's that got to do with teaching people in year groups in schools? Well, this is where an economist's insights become useful. If you dig up medieval battlefields, one of the things you discover is that most of the people who've been killed in the battle and dumped in these mass graves have died from a blow with a blunt instrument to the back of the head. In other words, they've been killed while they're running away. And the basic principle with medieval warfare, and indeed warfare in any time and place, is that if you run, you're dead. Here's the problem. Suppose we are all medieval foot soldiers. We're pikemen. And we're stood there, and holding the pike facing there, and a mounted knight, or a whole lot of mounted knights, which are basically one-man tanks, are charging at you. Now, if we all stick together and we don't move, we might have a chance of making it. We might be able to break the charge. Might. However, if we run, we're dead, because then we will be at the mercy of the knights, and they'll ride us down and they'll bash our brains in from behind with their swords or their maces or morning stars or whatever. However, if you're the first one to run, you'll probably escape. It's a bit like the famous joke about the two men running away from a bear. You don't have to run faster than the bear, you only have to run faster than the other person. So similarly, if you're the first person to run, you're probably going to make it. If you're the second person, 50-50. If you're the third person that runs, you're a goner. So this explains what is constantly observed in historical accounts of battles, which is that a line seems to be holding, then quite suddenly, almost as though a signal has been given, everyone turns tail and runs, and the battle is completely lost and everyone is slaughtered. And that's because one person's broken, and that causes a cascade effect. So the interesting question from the economist's point of view is, the individual incentives are to run, but the group incentives are to hold together. So how do you get people to not run, not respond rationally to the incentives they face as individuals? And over time, various methods have been used, but the one that works best is to create a very powerful sense of esprit de corps with the people you're fighting with. So that you're not fighting for your king, stuff that. What sane person wants to get killed for their king? You're not fighting for money, because again, that's not rational. What you're fighting for is to help your mates. And what stronger way of building up that sense of group identity than to have all the people who are fighting together in the military, people who have grown up together and gone through a formal schooling process together in the same group. That is why they introduced age group teaching. It's done in order to create military esprit de corps. Similarly, why have this system where the day is divided up into blocks of time, and where you go from learning history in one 2-hour block to learning German in another 2-hour block to learning Latin in another one, mechanics in another one? That, again, does not make sense. All the evidence we have from educational psychology from pedagogical practice is that if you want to learn something, it's hopeless to suddenly break off learning it after a short amount of time. You want to learn it in fairly long, coherent blocks of time. Think about it this way. If you really want to teach somebody something like how to speak a foreign language, how to drive a car, how to play a musical instrument, do you teach them the way they're taught in school? No, you don't. You go to a Berlitz language school, you go to a driving course, you go to a musical instructor, and you typically learn in fairly long, discrete blocks of time, and you don't switch about. So why do this? Well, it's done in order to teach habits of obedience. What it does is, it enables you to understand that you have to stop doing what you're doing right now, go and do something else. Why? Because the rules say that you must. In other words, it trains people for life in a factory, for working for a large firm. It trains people to live in the modern state, where you have to do what you're told all the time, without asking questions. The whole purpose and point of this system, in other words, is, as I say, to create obedient, productive workers and subjects. People who will do what they're told by their employers, do what they're told by the state, and will be loyal to both of them. Of course, in many cases, it doesn't. But then what the system also does is have a way of dealing with these awkward buggers who won't do what they're told. And we know this is a matter of physical chastisement sometimes, or other methods, methods designed to impose humiliation or social isolation on the people who disagree. Now, the first point to make is that when this was first invented, when the modern school was first thought up in this way, if you like, it had been theorised before then, but Stein and the reformers were the first people to actually do it. There were many other ways of education going on. Now, take the British case. In Britain, the common notion is that before the Education Act was passed in 1870, the so-called Forster Act, nobody was being educated, because that was the act that made compulsory attendance part of the law. It was the act that created elementary schools, funded by local taxes, which everyone had to attend up to a certain age. Secondary education comes along in 1902. That, in fact, is not true. The Newcastle Committee, which was a Royal Commission, Committee of Inquiry, reported in 1862 that, in fact, 90% of the population of the country were engaged in some kind of education. And if you look at the literacy levels, which were found by the 1861 and 1871 censi, what you find is that, in fact, the level of literacy at that time in Victorian England was just as high as it was going to be even after World War I. So most people were, in fact, getting the kind of education and the kind of skills that were meant to be theoretically imposed by the system set up by the Forster Act. The thing is, they weren't getting it in schools, not as we understand it. There were a lot of private schools, as well as mainly run by organisations like the Society of Friends, a lot of schools set up by the Society, in fact, but also by the SPCK, which was a major educational provider. That's, of course, an Anglican organisation, and other churches and other denominations. Also, a whole range of informal educational institutions, in particular what were known as dame schools, which were typically one-teacher schools which taught elementary education to the children, typically, of the very poorest section of Victorian society. A fellow called Phil Gardner, historian he was at Bristol, I forget what he is now. Anyway, Phil wrote a book about 30 years ago called The Lost Elementary Schools of Victorian England, which looked at this whole institution of the dame school and how it works. It was an amazing piece of historical research. He was able to show just how widespread this kind of institution was. So it wasn't the case that people weren't being educated. They were being educated, but they weren't being educated, as far as many people were concerned, in the, quote, right way, unquote. Worth saying, by the way, that this is an interesting point if you're, as I am, a libertarian or a classical liberal. One of the interesting things is that this is an issue which historically divided classical liberals very sharply. Many leading classical liberals, like Richard Cobden, for example, hardline advocate of laissez-faire, you might think, strong supporter of minimal government, Cobden supported universal, compulsory and free education provided by government. That was one of the things he was most keen on. John Bright, worth mentioning obviously in the Quaker context, another person who supported this despite being a radical advocate of limited government. Many of the people who were associated with the case for minimal government were also supporters of universal state education. On the other hand, there were many other great classical liberals, who were totally opposed to the so-called educational voluntarists, a fellow called Edward Baines, for example, from Leeds, another Quaker. Most notably, John Stuart Mill. Mill's own position is in fact the one that I myself hold. Mill argued that education should be compulsory, that it should not be provided by the government. His argument was that you couldn't simply rely on parents educating their own children, because there would always be a certain number of parents who were simply irresponsible or who for some other reason would not have their children educated. And Mill said, look, this is going to handicap the child and hinder their life prospects to such a degree that you just can't let that happen. So he said that the law had to require that children be educated. And he argued that what the state should do is have regular public tests which children would have to take, which would indicate whether or not they were being educated up to this minimal standard. But, Mill said, there's no way, he thought, that the government should provide the education. It should be entirely private. And on Liberty, and also in some of his other works, there's a very powerful passage where Mill says why he thinks this is a bad idea. The classic line is, "A system of general state education is a great contrivance for making all people exactly alike." Which in fact is precisely, he was absolutely on the money in that respect. And so Mill thought that while everyone should be educated, there was no way that the government should actually be providing this, much less the kind of Prussian system, which he was totally opposed to. As I say, that particular quote I took is from On Liberty, but you can find rather more extensive discussions on it in quite a number of his other essays and also in correspondence of his. So this is a big division, and it's an interesting question as to why it was. I don't have time to go into why it was myself right now. It has to do, I think, with the notion of character and the part that played in 19th century social thought. But anyway, the point is that it took a long time for the modern school to become the dominant kind of educational system in the modern world, a very long time. What was involved was, first of all, the transformation of existing institutions, because there were many schools, like the King Edward VI grammar schools, for example, which had been around for hundreds of years. And what was required was for these to be transformed, to make them into modern schools. And this is the kind of reform that the famous Dr. Arnold of Rugby was associated with, and other people of that sort. There's also the use of state power through legislation, like the Foster Act, to basically outlaw a whole range of alternatives to government schooling, and to insist, particularly at the elementary level, that you had to send your children not just to any kind of education, but to a state school, which was regulated and controlled by Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education, although the Victorians did allow a lot more local variation than we have since the national curriculum was set up, God help us. Now, what also happened was that it was a long time before the full, if you like, impact of the school system was felt, but it was felt, and dramatically so, not least in the summer of 1914, the anniversary that we've got coming up next year. I remember watching, some of you may have seen it, the old classic black and white film of All Quiet on the Western Front. How many of you have seen that film? Those of you who haven't, you must see it. One of the great films of all time. Based, of course, on the book by Erich Maria Remarque. There's a scene at the start where war has just broken out. And there's this classroom in Germany. Erich Maria Remarque and his friends are all the class, Prussian school, of course. And the teacher gives them this long harangue about how incredibly lucky they are and how jealous he is of them because they now have a chance to serve the fatherland and die gloriously on the battlefield for the fatherland. And they all cheer madly and they all rush out to enlist in the military. And then, of course, they're fighting at Verdun, they're on the Western Front, all kinds of really terrible things happen to them. And 3 years pass, it's 1917, and the German army is now in really bad shape, and they're actually starting to conscript middle-aged people, and their old teacher turns up in the trenches with them because he's been conscripted, and none of them will talk to him. But by this point, it's too late. Now, the point is, in 1914, there was enormous enthusiasm for the war. The job that the modern schools have been doing throughout Europe proved to be brilliantly successful in terms of creating loyalty to the state. There is no way, absolutely no way, that 18th century people or earlier 19th century people would have signed up and voluntarily put them through 4 years of hell fighting on the Eastern Front or the Western Front the way that soldiers did in the first part of the 20th century. Most 18th century peasants thought of war as the king's business, nothing to do with them. They absolutely, a complete pain in the backside, basically. Particularly if it resulted in them being killed or having their crops destroyed by rampaging soldiers. But unfortunately, the modern school had succeeded in making people identify their life interests with the rulers in a way that had not been possible before. They'd also produced extraordinarily obedient and productive workers who worked in the new kind of large corporate firms that appeared in the second half of the 19th century. In other words, they were in fact a brilliant success. Since then, the modern state, particularly since the modern school, I should say, particularly since the 1970s, has required an additional purpose, and this purpose in fact is probably its paramount one now, and that is to act essentially as a allocative machine or filter. The main job of modern education is not what people laughably tell you. That's not what people pay for example, when they go to private education. The job of the school now is to basically decide who gets high-paid, high-status jobs. I don't know if you know, but in mathematics they have a thing called the sieve of Eratosthenes, which is a mechanism for finding prime numbers. What you do is you have an array of all the integers. First you cross out all the even numbers greater than 2, then you cross out all the numbers that can be divided by 3, then all the numbers that can be divided by 5, then all the numbers that can be divided by 7, and what you're left with are the prime numbers, which have no divisors apart from themselves. And that is essentially what the modern formal education system is. What it does is, first of all, you eliminate about half of the people in the school. They're just going to do either no jobs at all or rubbish jobs. And then the whole system is designed to filter out the people who are going to go into high-paid, high-status jobs. How does this work? Well, it's done through what economists call the signalling mechanism. The common notion is that education is about human capital, as it's called. It gives you skills. It increases and enhances your human capital. That may have been the case in modern schools, say in the 19th or 20th century. Nowadays, the human capital element of particularly secondary and tertiary education is very, very limited. Most of it is about giving a signal to potential employers. That's why if you go do a degree at university, the chances that you will actually use that degree in the work you do when you graduate are incredibly low, less than 5% in fact. And that's why when you apply for jobs, most employers couldn't give the proverbial monkeys about what subject your degree was in or what you did. What they're interested in just is the fact that you've done a degree. And what does that tell them? It sends a signal that you basically are an obedient person who will do what you're told, that you can stick to a task and avoid distractions, that you are reasonably socially coherent and you're not going to embarrass them by dribbling down your front when they meet clients. And that basically, therefore, you will be a useful employee. And also, very often, it indicates that you come from a particular class background. So that's what the whole signalling package is. So essentially, modern education is a crucial part of the manipulation of the labour market. It's all about deciding who goes into what kind of career. And in particular, certification, formal certification by universities and professional schools in particular, is key to the privileged position of the contemporary elite. We are increasingly dominated by a professional elite of managers and experts whose claim to authority rests on paper certification. And so the modern education system is absolutely crucial in legitimising and also giving the imprimatur to this new kind of elite. Now, that, as I say, is the situation. What is important to realise, therefore, is that the modern school is a crucial central institution of the contemporary modern state, and also of modern class formation. It's crucial in understanding how power and status and differential access to wealth are controlled and regulated in the modern economy. Now, what is going on? Well, I told you how when I heard Sheldon, that transformed my thinking about what schools are about. Well, a few years ago, several years after I heard Sheldon give that talk, I heard a talk by another friend of mine, which opened up another sort of window to me. This is a fellow called Greg Remke. Greg is American. He has an organisation, it's basically himself, called Economic Thinking. And what he does is he works with high school debaters, which is a big thing in the United States. And he basically provides debate teams with facts, if you will, arguments and evidence to support the arguments that they can use in high school debating contests. Well, latterly, Greg has been working a lot with homeschooled people who are doing increasingly well in debate competitions, as they are in every other kind of competition. Homeschooling is explosively growing in the United States. It used to be a very, very small phenomenon, largely found amongst extremely devout religious people. This is no longer the case. The number of people involved in home education is now so large that less than half of them now qualify as being in any way religiously devout. And also, it doesn't correspond with any particular point of view on the political spectrum, as Greg found out. What has happened is that as a result, there's a kind of revolutionary transformation of education going on in the United States, which Greg discovered through working with these young teens, 14 to 17-year-olds, on these debates. And this is just one aspect of a more general revolution in education that is going on worldwide at the moment. The modern school, which I just talked about for the last half hour, is actually on the way out. And my prediction is that in the next 20 years, it's going to collapse. So what is the nature of this revolution? Well, the first is the development in poor parts of the world of a completely new model of educational delivery, which still keeps quite a lot of the school model, but is rapidly moving away from it. This is particularly true in Africa, but you also find it in parts of Asia and Latin America. The person who's uncovered this is a friend of mine, James Tooley, a professor of education at Newcastle University. What James has discovered is that in Africa, for example, or in Brazil, 80% of the people of school age do not go to state schools. They go to private schools. There's a wonderful documentary he made, which is associated with his book, The Beautiful Tree, which you can get on YouTube, or clips of it on YouTube. I recommend you look at them. He goes to schools in one of the poorest and worst parts of Lagos, which is an extremely violent city, which has a lot of really poor people at the bottom of the Nigerian educational and social heap. And in the state school, the kids are running riot. There are no books because the school people are corrupt and have sold off the books or use the budget to line their own pockets. And the teacher is fast asleep on the desk most of the time. He also looks then at private schools, which really poor parents pay for their children to go through. And these schools are providing, in the face of enormous odds it has to be said, a really good basic education, which is why the parents are prepared to do it. But what has happened in Africa since James went over there and did this has been quite simply a radical transformation, brought about really by this, the mobile phone. It's one of the ways in which African society generally has been transformed by the mobile phone. What you have emerging all over sub-Saharan Africa are chains of private schools. The most famous of these is called the Bridge network. It's founded in Kenya by a couple of Kenyan entrepreneurs. Basically, this is a system of franchised village schools. You have a kind of school in a box. What you do is you apply to run a school to Bridge, and if Bridge, you satisfy the people at the Bridge that you are an appropriate and suitable person, they then send you this kind of box or kit which enables you to set up the school. Why has this got to do with the mobile phone? Well, the reason is that now no cash has to change hand. All the payments, including salary payments to teachers and payments of fees by parents, are done through mobile phone transfers. And what this means is that the problem of corruption, which was a crippling one in Africa before this, has just vanished because you have a totally secure means of monetary transfer. This is also, this has been transforming Africa's economy generally, actually, as I said. And the Bridge already has nearly 200 schools. Their goal, which they're well on a target to reach, is to have 3,000 schools across Africa by the end of this decade. Now, I say schools, but these are actually not like schools as we understand them, because they don't have the features of the modern school, which I outlined earlier, the teaching by age group, the rigidly structured day, and things of that sort. That also relates to what Greg Remke discovered in the United States. You now have so many parents who are homeschooling their children that a whole range of educational institutions have sprung up to serve them. But these are not schools in the conventional sense, they're more like learning centres. So let's say in a given area, an area about the size, let's say, of Midlothian, including Edinburgh, you have about 200 or 300 families who are homeschooling their children. What you will then have is an entrepreneur who will create a learning centre. The learning centre is essentially a building, usually a rented building, which will have facilities, online facilities, reading materials and the like. They will hire in skilled tutors who are very often university graduates, some of the parents sometimes, very often professionals, who will come in and teach intensive week or 2 week or 3 week long courses. So what will happen is these 200 or 300 children, or some of them anyway, once through at the right appropriate level, will all come to the learning centre for maybe 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks they'll be taught nothing but the one subject. They'll get a really intensive course in, say, history or physics, mathematics, French, whatever it might be. which will be taught by real experts, and they'll then go off and do their own thing, and come back at another occasion for another course. The point is, it's a model of educational delivery which is highly flexible, it's demand-led, and it doesn't involve the kind of highly structured, formulaic pattern of the modern school that Wilhelm von Humboldt and his mates set up. And this kind of institution is now spreading like wildfire in the poorer parts of the world. The point being that in places like Brazil, or Nigeria, or Ghana, or Kenya, the official state education system is so utterly bad, or virtually non-existent in many cases, that nobody uses it. So what Africans and Brazilians have is the well-known economic phenomenon of the advantages of being late adopters, or they do not have lots of sunk capital of various kinds in an existing school system. They can move directly to this newly emerging form of education, which is much more like, say, A.S. Neil's Summerhill than any kind of conventional school or model. But even more dramatic is the effect that's being had on education, particularly higher education, by the internet, and the way in which this is essentially destroying a huge amount of conventional higher education initially, but increasingly secondary education as well. There's a number of people at leading American universities, MIT, Harvard, Caltech, who have basically thought, well, okay, here I am teaching people the same way people taught at Harvard when it was first set up in the 17th century. I'm standing in a lecture theatre, a bit like this one, way I am now, talking to a bunch of people. And I then basically set them papers, they hand the papers in, I mark the papers, or they don't hand the papers in, they come up with rubbish excuses. But anyway, whatever it is, you mark the papers, you give them back marks and so on. And they said, well, with modern technology, with the internet, what I could do is I could give the lecture as a podcast over the internet, and it could be watched by people all over the planet. And what I could then do is have set tasks, and I would also set up a chat room, and people who had watched the lecture could pick up the assignment and work on the assignment, not just on their own, but also in conjunction with other people, because of the chat room format, and then submit the assignment online. And this has been done increasingly. It's also led to the development of, amongst other things, intelligent software which grades the kind of elementary papers that a lot of first and secondary American college students do, kind of MCQs, tests that they do. But even when you've not got that, when you've got what they call a term paper, what we would call an essay, it's very easy to grade. You can actually do the work very, very rapidly if you're the remote tutor. What this means is that you can have a Harvard or MIT level education virtually for nothing if you are the student. Not only that, the experience is that the whole experience of doing this, watching the lecture, which you can watch when it's convenient for you, not at the time that you have to watch it. So that's why it can be done anywhere in the world. You can just download the podcast and listen to the lecture. You can take part in a seminar, a webinar, with the tutor and actually interact directly with them. And now that may mean getting up in the middle of the night if you're not in the United States, but that's even there. There may be more than one tutor on the course. There'll be somebody who will be doing it more locally. But above all, you can actually interact with lots of other students in the seminar, and people are apparently much more prepared to interact online than they are, much more prepared to say things and do things than they are if they're actually face-to-face in a small group. So the point is that this is completely transforming higher education. Tyler Cowen, a friend of mine, quite a well-known economist, George Mason University in Virginia, Tyler reckons that within 10 years, most of the universities in the United States will have gone out of business, or will have been transformed into online-only institutions. He thinks the only ones that will survive will be the really top 40 or 50 schools, as the Americans call them, places like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and they will survive only because essentially of their social networking function. They will still be the places essentially where the children of the elite go to get married and make contacts that they'll follow throughout the rest of their life. He thinks that for anyone who's actually interested in education, you will not bother going to university and paying some humongous amount in fees. Why do that when you can get a much more flexible, customer-driven form of education and learning for a fraction of the cost, or even probably for free? So what is going on at the moment is just the early stages, I think, of a radical transformation of education, where what we're seeing is the development of a whole range of new institutional forms, things that are going to completely change the way education is delivered, and which are going to overthrow, I think, the existing model that we saw set up back in 1806 in Prussia. Now, why do I think it's going to overthrow it, though? Why am I so confident about that? Well, it's because, as I said, the modern school has stopped working, if you will. Having been a brilliant success in terms of achieving its real goals, it's no longer doing this. And one of the reasons is because of the change that I mentioned earlier, which is the way in which it's become increasingly a means of manipulating and directing the job market in order to work out who gets the high-paid, high-status jobs. The thing is that increasingly it's not doing its job properly, or to put it more bluntly, most of the people who are going through it are realising that they're basically getting scammed. This is most clear in the United States, I think, where there are loads of people who have got enormous, humongous student debts, which they've taken on board on the basis that they're going to get a high-paid job, and they're discovering, in fact, well, no, they aren't. I used to work also still do in a way, for an organisation called the Institute of Humane Studies, which supports young scholars. And we had a kind of in-house joke there that we need to have a kind of standard little business card which has on it 5 reasons why you shouldn't go to law school. Because we're constantly trying to persuade young American students not to go to law school. And the reasons are quite straightforward. You're going to end up in an enormous amount of debt, earning, unless you go to work for one of the very few really big law firms, you're going to be earning just above the average income, not significantly more than the average income. So you're going to spend the rest of your life paying off that debt, basically, and you're probably going to be doing a job you hate. Personally, I can't think of anything worse, really. So, the kind of line that we basically give to everyone is, well, look, you say you want to go to law school. If you really want to be a lawyer, and you like being a lawyer, and you like the idea of basically spending most of your life doing conveyancing, or maybe if you're really lucky, family law, then do it. Otherwise, don't. And in particular, don't do it because your parents want you to, which is the usual reason, because they think you're going to get a high-paid job. But the point is that that's the kind of extreme case of a more general phenomenon. And what is happening, therefore, is that I think people are increasingly, if you like, dissatisfied with the system as it is, because it is not delivering what it purports to deliver. And there's a huge amount of people who basically deeply resent the system they have, which is manifesting itself in things like extremely high truancy rates. And so I think that is why this kind of transformation that's going on is going to actually sweep away the existing system. Final point to make is that this is nothing to do with politics, this process I'm describing. It's nothing to do with people like myself who advocate small government and libertarian politics. It's a completely spontaneous social and market process, which is driven ultimately by technology, primarily. And it's a process of change, if you will, which is coming from the bottom up. Nobody's planned it. There's no great design. It's just lots and lots of individual entrepreneurs, individual parents, individual pupils doing what they want to do. But the result, given modern technology, is that they're transforming education. And so I think that, in fact, within a very short space of time, we may say that the modern school has had a 200-year lifespan, and it's gone. So I might well stop.